For a film made on such a modest budget, Local Hero has certainly left its mark on the Scottish cultural zeitgeist. It captured the concerns and attitudes of a nation in that particular point of history, and through observational comedy gave Scotland the chance to laugh at themselves, but also take a long look in the mirror about the type of people we wanted to be. The story begins by introducing up-and-coming Texas oil executive McIntyre, or Mac. Mac is summoned by his eccentric boss, oil baron Felix Happer, who is sending Mac on a business trip to acquire the small fictitious fishing village of Fairness on the west coast of Scotland. The village sits on a uniquely positioned beach, unlike any other in Scotland, that is ideal for the construction of an oil refinery.
Oh, this is a bay in a million. It's the only one on the west coast where the silt's deep enough to take the foundation piles.
At the time of the film's making, the world and very much indeed Scotland were undergoing some dramatic changes.
With the announcement of the first results of BP's exploratory tests in the Forsyth field, it now seems obvious that the North Sea is going to become one of the world's major oil fields.
The discovery of giant oil fields in the North Sea, followed by the oil crises of 73 and 79, meant that in the 1980s Scotland was hit by a tidal wave of oil money.
Big money attracts these modern prospectors like steel chips to a magnet.
The speed at which this new industry took off meant that the expertise needed for the operation were lacking domestically. This provided a prime opportunity for American companies to swoop in and get their share. And so Mac arrives in Aberdeen, where he meets his Scottish counterpart Danny Oldsson, played by Peter Capaldi in one of his first on-screen appearances. I never cease to find it hilarious that the lovably dorky Danny is played by the same man who brought us Malcolm Tucker.
We're in a weird and wonderful world where everything is different. Maybe outside the polar ice caps have melted. Maybe there's fucking robots knocking about and Davina McCall's the new pope. Maybe you can download rice.
On their journey to the village, Mac and Danny pass through a patch of fog. This symbolises the crossing of the threshold, a step in the traditional hero's journey. From this point, our heroes are entering an unknown world that will both challenge them and change them. This fog is also one of the first references to the theme of mysticism that runs through the film. The diver Danny eventually falls in love with is another. She's a sort of modern-day interpretation of the Selkie, seal people, the Scottish mythology equivalent of a mermaid.
We're keeping an eye on them though. There's only 50,000 left in the Atlantic right now.
Sailors used to think they were mermaids, yeah?
In folktales, these creatures on the eve of midsummer would lure love-struck humans into the water, never to return to dry land again. When our heroes arrive in the village, they meet the collected and unflappable Gordon Urquhart, who some may recognise as Wedge Antilles from Star Wars. Like many Highlanders, Gordon has multiple jobs. He both runs the hotel our heroes are staying in, and is also the chartered accountant for the whole village.
Hello again. I'm Gordon Urquhart. We tend to double up on jobs around here. I'm a taxi driver sometimes too. Sit down. What can I do for you?
And so begins the subversion of many a movie trope. See, you would be forgiven for expecting Gordon to throw the pair out of his office, and the villagers to riot at the idea of a big oil firm buying up their village. But of course, that's not the case. Much of the movie's plot revolves around Gordon, working on the money-crazed natives' behalf, to extort as much money out of Mac as possible.
Well, Edward, I wonder what the poor people are doing tonight.
But Peter, I thought all this money would make me feel different.
The reason this goes against expectations is because of the common trope in Hollywood and Western storytelling of the noble savage. The trope is based on the romantic idea of a person or people uncorrupted by civilization, used often when portraying Native Americans, African tribes, and rural communities. The idea is that these untouched indigenous people have a deep and spiritual connection to their home and heritage, and by extension cannot be corrupted or tempted with materialistic possessions or money. In its crudest form, essentially saying these groups have a blissful and peaceful existence due to their ignorance.
Bongo, 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 I don't wanna leave the Congo, no, 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 no.
Local Hero goes against this by showing the villagers getting riled up and excited by the prospect of being millionaires. So much so that they eventually storm down to the beach in a mob, to the small hut of old Ben, the only man in the community refusing to take the money, and thereby jeopardising the whole deal. The film was made at a time that this sort of acquisition and destruction of small communities was commonplace all over Scotland, and for the most part there was little resistance, when there was enough big money floating around. The film is meant to ask the Scottish people if this is really the kind of people we want to be, that we should stand up to the destruction of communities and of our environment. I mean, there's a reason that this is Al Gore's favourite movie. Now, let's talk a little about Stereotypes. Local Hero shows Scottish culture whilst avoiding tartanry generalisations. It avoids portraying a lazy symbolic ethnicity where culture is distilled down to twee and disingenuous aesthetics. Scottish heritage isn't just kilts, tartans and groundskeeper Willie.
Damn Scots! They ruined Scotland!
The dreamlike Vangelis-inspired soundtrack by Mark Knopfler, from the band Dire Straits, doesn't contain any sodding bagpipes, instead featuring modern interpretations of traditional Celtic and Gaelic music. Though Bill Forsyth's script still contains a few stereotypes, but they're more observational in nature and provide the light-hearted comedy of the film. As someone who grew up in rural Scotland, I can recognise many of the villagers as people I know in real life. The one guy who's constantly tearing up and down the road on his motorcycle, the solitary punk or goth who lives miles away from anyone else of their subculture, and probably most notably, I see the mannerisms of my grandfather everywhere.
Are you sure there are 2 L's in dollar, Gideon? Yes. And now there are 2 G's in bugger off.
In the final act, Mac's boss, Happer, arrives in the village. He falls in love with the place and decides to cancel the plans to build the refinery, instead opting to build an observatory and marine biology research centre, injecting money into the local economy rather than buying everybody out. Happer is played by the Hollywood star Burt Lancaster. Bill Forsyth admits that the part was actually written for Lancaster after hearing in an interview that he wished he had done more comedy during his career, and it's only by a miracle of circumstance that Lancaster ended up in the film, though his fee was more than double the film's total budget, hence why the originally low-budget indie film had to seek studio funding. Warner Brothers had a mostly hands-off approach to the production, so it's safe to say that the film is close to Forsyth's vision, though after filming had wrapped, the studio decided that the ending was too much of a downer. It ends with Mac returning to his empty life in America. He empties his pockets of shells he collected from the beach and stares out over the loud hustle and bustle of the city. Fade to black. The end. During the course of the film, we see Mac going more native the longer he stays in Furness. He stops shaving, he starts wearing woolen jumpers, and starts checking the road for Ricky on his motorcycle before crossing. In one of the most touching scenes in the film, a drunk Mac tells Gordon he would give anything to trade lives with him.
I'll make a good Gordon. What do you say, pal?
The studio wanted the film to have that fairy tale ending, where Mac returns to Scotland, marries a local girl, and has a happy ending. Forsyth believed this ending would go against the whole feeling of the entire movie, and I agree with him. And here's why. A few summers ago, a friend of mine was working in a hotel in the Inner Hebrides. I travelled out to visit him and stayed for 4 days. There I met a small community of people, all world-wise with interesting stories. This small island was a world away. It felt like a frontier, one that I almost didn't leave. There was an opportunity to find work and spend the rest of my summer on the island, an opportunity I didn't take. The people I met are nothing more than names on a Facebook friend list now. People I felt a strange bond with at the time. If they felt the same for me, who knows? I guess I'll never know now. Because how is it possible to tell someone you knew for 4 days that they changed a little part of you forever? When I watch Local Hero, I can't help but see myself in Mac. Like him, I had just gone through a breakup with my girlfriend before going on the trip. My course at university had suddenly become a soul-consuming chore. The beach where filming took place, which in reality is 200 miles away from where the village scenes were filmed, in fact looks out on those remote islands where I spent that long weekend. The film, throughout its runtime, has an undercurrent of sadness to it. A dreamlike quality, but like all dreams, you have to eventually wake up. Mac has to wake up, leaving Furness to return to his life with nothing but a few souvenirs, as did I when I returned to the mainland.